at Panic Gaming.
Awesome!
1995 was an amazing year for gamers, as it saw the very beginnings of the 32-bit revolution, while also giving us some of the best games at the tail end of the 16-bit generation. And the Super Nintendo in particular received one amazing game after another that even 30 years later still hold up as some great titles that I and many other gamers go back to on a regular basis. Fighters, RPGs, platformers, it was an absolute avalanche of 16-bit awesomeness. So let's take a look back 30 years into the past to the fabled year of 1995, and what I think were the very best games to grace the SNES that year. Hold on to your butts.
All I can say is...
Super Mario is back in action on your Super NES. Yoshi is the focus of this awesome 16-meg game, and it's non-stop action through more than 60 wild levels in Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island.
First up, you can't talk about the SNES in 1995 and not immediately think of Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, a sequel that itself was 5 years in the making and had a lot to live up to. And though opinions on it are mixed, I personally think it's not only more than a worthy sequel, but depending on the day, I actually prefer it over the original Super Mario World. It's definitely a big deviation from its predecessor in terms of its visual presentation, sound design, and gameplay, and I love it for that. Nintendo could have played it safe and just given us Mario World 1.5, and I'm sure nobody would have complained. But instead, we got a whole new kind of adventure, and a prequel of sorts to the entire Super Mario saga, with the Yoshis escorting Baby Mario through all manner of hazards, traps, and enemies on his way to safety, beating anyone who would dare harm the little tyke in the head with giant Yoshi eggs, thrown with deadly accuracy. It's true that the crying Baby Mario can get pretty irritating, but that's a minor gripe really when you consider the gameplay variety in the myriad of stages, bonus minigames, and boss battles, which in some cases are downright epic. Especially the final confrontation with the giant baby Bowser. Yes, indeed, the gameplay here was fun, challenging, and diverse, and it can't be argued that this isn't one of the best looking SNES games, period. The crayon-styled visuals have a real charm to them, and even today, this is just an all-around pleasant game to look at, and it's equally as pleasant to listen to with an upbeat and catchy soundtrack. As long as you can keep Baby Mario from crying, that is. Whether or not you like this or the first game better all comes down to personal preference, but I think most of you will agree that Yoshi's Island is a certified classic, and definitely one of the best games to grace the SNES in 1995.
Sure you don't have room for another little bonus level? Super Mario World 2, only on the Super NES. Still the big one.
On the system that keeps pounding out the hits, Super NES. Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Conquest. It's even tougher than the original.
Next up, another sequel to an all-time classic, and a game that in the minds of many surpasses the original. And that is Donkey Kong Country 2 Diddy's Conquest. And hot damn what a game this was. It's actually kind of shocking that it was released only about a year after the first DKC, because this game is loaded with a ton of very intricately designed stages, a ton of bonus minigames, all new enemies, and a new playable character in Dixie Kong, who kinda steals the show here as she's just as fast and nimble as Diddy, but her hairspin hover ability really comes in handy. And on the whole, this game just feels like Rare took everything they learned with the original DKC, discarded the few bits that weren't so great, and made a bigger and better game. Again, in just under a year, which is mind-blowing. The gameplay is so incredibly smooth and eases you in with some easier levels, letting you get acquainted with some of the new mechanics, and then puts your skills to the test with some especially tricky platforming, which definitely can be frustrating at times, but the controls are so rock solid that it never feels cheap. And that's just good game design. And in true Rare fashion, there are a ton of collectibles to look out for, bonus stages, shortcuts, new animal companions, and a bunch of cool boss fights. On top of that, while the original DKC blew everyone away with its frankly amazing graphics for the time, DKC 2 looks even better with some especially elaborate backgrounds and even more detailed character models than before. I'm still impressed with what Rare achieved here even to this day. And last but not least, this has to be considered one of the best soundtracks on the console, bar none. It might just be my all-time favorite. In short, Diddy's Kong Quest is one of, if not the best platformers on the SNES. It's just plain awesome.
Personally, I think Dixie Kong is the coolest, and I happen to think that her helicopter hairspin is the most awesome move in her arsenal.
It's everything you love about the arcade game. Cut down to size.
Next up, another absolute classic from Rare, and that is Killer Instinct, which is among the best fighting games on the SNES in my opinion. Up there with Super Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat 2. And also a game that when I first played it way back in the day, I was very skeptical that it was going to be able to live up to the sheer awesomeness that was Killer Instinct in the arcades, which itself was being used to hype up the next generation Nintendo console. And while the SNES port isn't nearly as impressive as its arcade counterpart in the visuals department, it's still an outstanding looking game by the standards of the SNES, which in hindsight isn't all that surprising considering the wizardry Rare pulled off with the DK Country games. But more importantly, the solid gameplay of the arcade game is still fully intact. Killer Instinct features some very responsive controls and high-speed, challenging gameplay that had me hooked as a kid, and to this day, picking this game up every so often still feels pretty damn good. Pulling off big combos, annihilating your enemies with some wild finishing moves, and attaining the coveted Supreme Victory is just as fun now as it was in 1995. Characters like Full Gore, Combo, and my main Cinder are some of the coolest fighters to ever grace a video game. The stage designs are varied and elaborate, and the whole thing is topped off with an all-time banger of a soundtrack that crunched the arcade tunes down into a 16-bit cartridge, and still managed to give us something very listenable. And between this and Diddy's Kong Quest, Rare was really on fire with their soundtracks in '95. And to sum up, Killer Instinct is the total package of great graphics and sound mixed with some outstanding gameplay that puts it among the very best 16-bit fighters and the best the SNES had to offer in 1995.
Killer Instinct only on Super NES, complete with Killer Cuts game music CD. It's totally uncensored. So who needs a new system?
Next up, perhaps a bit of a contentious pick, but I think Castlevania Dracula X is one of the more solid titles released on the SNES in 1995, though it's definitely far from a perfect game. For starters, it has to be said that Dracula X doesn't hold a candle to Super Castlevania 4, or at least if you ask me, though I'm admittedly biased as that's one of my all-time favorite games. The controls in 4 are pretty much perfect, and the 8-directional whipping is an absolute godsend, while Dracula X goes back to the classic NES design of only being able to whip straight ahead. Or more accurately, it emulates the gameplay of the PC Engine Dracula X, which it made sense for that game to feature the same controls as the NES because its standard controller is essentially the same. and I find this game to be much more difficult than either Castlevania 4 or the PC Engine game for that matter, sometimes frustratingly so. But being difficult doesn't necessarily make a game bad. Dracula X offers up some solid platforming action and a ton of classic enemies to take on, many of which would carry over into Symphony of the Night. You also get your classic sub-weapons like the Cross and Holy Water, and a big bunch of monstrous bosses to take down with the legendary Vampire Killer Whip, ultimately culminating with a final showdown with Dracula that at first seemed very daunting. But once you figure out his attack patterns, he's actually one of the easier iterations of the Vampire Lord. Overall, I say Dracula X is still a solid game. And in terms of visuals, it's a tight race, but I'd say it's the best looking 16-bit Castlevania game. And the soundtrack is, as you'd expect from the series, simply amazing. This is a game that took some time to grow on me, but ultimately I came to love it. And it's another great SNES offering from 1995.
X. この冬 X は進化するノンストップアクションロックマン X2 スーパーファミコンで発売中カプコン
Next up, we have a double dose of the Blue Bomber, as 1995 brought us not one, but two different Mega Man games, with Mega Man X2 being released in January and Mega Man 7 finally bringing the classic series to the SNES in September. X2 had a lot to live up to, considering the first game was, in my estimation, a near-perfect action platformer and another one of my all-time favorite games. But once again, Capcom delivered on some truly awesome graphics, sound, and gameplay. The premise didn't change much, Mega Man games never really did, but it took the new mechanics established in the previous game, like wall jumping and finding hidden upgrades to grant X some new abilities, and it refined the gameplay a bit, with some fantastic stage designs, some cool new enemies and stage hazards to look out for, and of course 8 new Mavericks to contend with that had some truly wild designs. You blast your way through the initial 8 stages, powering up X along the way, and finding the parts needed to reconstruct Zero after he sacrificed himself in the first game, eventually leading to a handful of boss stages and a final showdown with the one and only Sigma. X2 is indeed a worthy follow-up to the original in terms of its gameplay. This is a very fun and moderately challenging game that once again features some super smooth controls and intense action, and arguably even better visuals than the original. I still prefer the soundtrack of X1, but the music in X2 is certainly no slouch. And all things considered, I'd say Capcom knocked it out of the park with this sequel. On the other hand, Mega Man 7 was a return to the classic series. And honestly, the first time I played this game, I wasn't so sure that I liked it, as by that point, I'd become accustomed to the high-intensity action and more serious tone of the X series. But in time, I came to love this game, and it reminded me why I liked the Mega Man series in the first place, as some of the first video games I have any memory of ever playing are Mega Man 2 and 3 on the NES. Here, the traditional formula is in full effect, with Dr. Wily breaking out of captivity and once again wreaking havoc with 8 new Robot Masters. And this is the game that introduced a couple of new characters to the series. First being Otto, a new helper robot built by Dr. Light, and he'll be happy to situate you with various bonus items in exchange for the bolts that you collect from defeated enemies. The other new characters are Bass, a new rival for Mega Man, and his robotic dog Treble, who is obviously the counterpart to Rush, who in this game comes in very handy, as in addition to some of his classic functions, also has a search mode to help you find hidden items, and just like in Mega Man 6, can also convert into power armor for some added defense and firepower. So there's a lot going on here, but at its core, it's still just good old Mega Man. It's a solid action platformer with creative enemies, fun stages to play through, and plenty of hidden secrets to uncover. Plus, considering the previous 6 games were all on the NES, it was just nice to see the world of the original Mega Man now fully realized in 16 bits. This is a great looking game with some especially colorful visuals and great character designs. And the sound design, all things considered, is really solid too. And between this and X2, I'd say 1995 was a great year for the Blue Bomber.
パワーアップしたロックマンの秘密を暴くのじゃ。行くぞマイリー。今度はスーパーファミコンで勝負だ。ロックマン7好評発売中。カプコン。
Next up, we have yet another awesome offering from Capcom with Final Fight 3, which is not only the best Final Fight game, but also one of the best 16-bit beat-em-ups in general. And it made a lot of improvements over its two predecessors. It gives you 4 playable characters to choose from, including the return of Guy after being absent in the second game, and the introduction of Lucia, who would eventually make a comeback in Street Fighter V. The gameplay is more or less the same as the previous 2 games. You beat the brakes off of a bunch of bad guys with your bare fists and an assortment of melee weapons. But this time around, you can also pull off some cool Street Fighter style special attacks in addition to their standard attacks. Plus, you still get a desperation attack that sacrifices a bit of health, and a new super attack that you can execute when your super combo meter is full. And these are some very welcome additions, as by 1995 there'd been about a million Final Fight style beat-em-ups that all more or less played the same. So some added gameplay features were just what the doctor ordered. Another cool addition was the ability to play with a CPU-controlled ally, just in case you don't have a second player handy. And overall, this is just a great playing and fun beat-em-up that I still go back to on a fairly regular basis. And it's also the best looking of the 3 Final Fight games with some very nice visuals, and the soundtrack is pretty damn good too. I'm something of a beat-em-up enthusiast, so this was always gonna be a favorite of mine, and it's one of the better SNES games to be released in 1995. Next up, the sequel to one of my all-time favorite games, and that's Earthworm Jim 2, which is a game that certainly has its critics. It went in some pretty weird directions, but I'm personally in the camp that loves this game. The first game was a fairly straightforward action platformer that featured some wacky characters with great visuals and music. And while EWJ2 again features some top-notch visuals and sound design and is for the most part still a platformer, there are a lot of stages that really mix up the gameplay, such as Jim turning into a blind cave salamander and navigating through a void filled with pinball bumpers, or using a giant marshmallow to save Peter Puppy's puppies as they're tossed out of a window by Psychro. It's certainly weird, but definitely fun, and at the very least, you can't accuse it of being more of the same. On the other hand, the platforming stages are still really fun, giving Jim some nifty new abilities and a whole bunch of cool new weapons to make use of, like finger guns, homing missiles, and the uber powerful brick house gun, which pretty much wipes out everything on the screen. If I have one complaint with the gameplay, it's the lack of boss fights. There's really only a couple. But aside from that, I love the gameplay here, and again, this is a great looking game. Some of the best graphics on the console, in fact, with some very detailed animation on the characters and elaborately designed stages. The soundtrack is really good too, though again kind of contentious, but tracks like Anything But Tangerines and Lorenzo Soil are some absolute bangers. I don't like EWJ2 quite as much as the original, but that's a hard act to follow. But still, I say this game is an absolute classic, and another one of the better games to grace the SNES 30 long years ago.
Note to self, do not throw supervillains at buses full of orphans.
If you had jalapenos and beans for every meal.
Next up, another game from Interplay, but unlike Earthworm Jim, this one was actually developed by them too. And that's Boogerman, a pick and flick adventure, which was first released on the Sega Genesis in 1994. And even though I actually prefer that version, this port is still fantastic and is actually the first one I played when I rented it shortly after its release in 1995. I actually did a full review of Boogerman recently, so I don't have too much to add to that. But in short, this is, in my mind, something of an underappreciated game in the annals of 16-bit platformers, overshadowed by the Marios and Sonics of the day, but it's among my favorites. The controls are tight and responsive, the level designs are elaborate and loaded with hidden secrets and power-ups, there are a big bunch of fun and wacky boss characters to take on, along with a legion of inventive enemies. And Boogerman himself has a wide variety of disgusting abilities at his disposal, including deadly gas attacks and of course a near endless supply of boogers to fling at enemies. Or better yet, he can fart fire and even fly through the air after eating a chili pepper. Very much like real life. This game is packed to the brim with gross out humor, which is what most people really know it for. But underneath all of that is just an all-around solid and fun platformer with some especially nice visuals. Just like Earthworm Jim, Boogerman features a lot of hand-drawn frames of animation worked into the game, making it look like something of a 16-bit cartoon, with both the characters and stages being very colorful and detailed. And the snotty icing on the cake is an awesome soundtrack by the one and only Matt Furness. So even though it's a port, and it's arguably not as good as its Sega counterpart, Boogerman is still, in my opinion, one of the best SNES games released in 1995.
Hey, boogers aren't his only weapon.
Wasn't me!
Alright, son, what's he look like?
Well, he was pink.
Caucasian?
No, pink.
And big, you saying?
Yeah, like a big marshmallow.
Yeah, what'd he do?
He made me and my friend play this game, Avalanche, and he'd dump all these little blobs on me. And the only way that I could survive was if I buried my buddy in boulders.
Oh, look, he's a cutie. Is this the guy?
Next up, we have one of the best puzzle games on the SNES, and that's Kirby's Avalanche, which is common knowledge now that this is essentially just Puyo Puyo, but with Kirby characters. And surprisingly, some people think that's a knock against it, that it's just a reskin of an older game. But I honestly couldn't care less, because I'll always play Puyo Puyo in whatever form I can. Plus, you have to consider that at the time, Puyo Puyo wasn't a known series in North America, which is why we got this and Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine on the Genesis. Anyway, of all the different properties you could reskin a Puyo Puyo game as, Kirby was a perfect choice, as its colorful and lighthearted visual style and assortment of cute characters matches up with the vibes of the original games. If you've still somehow never played either this or any Puyo Puyo games, they're some of the most addictive puzzle games ever made, challenging you to match up Puyos of the same color to clear them from the board, while an opponent is doing the same. And by chaining together a big bunch of Puyos all at once, you send over an avalanche of junk Puyos that come crashing down on your opponent. And this is a game that gets even better when you've got a second player available, as the matches can get pretty heated. It's still a ton of fun even if you're only playing single player though, and in terms of visuals, this is one of the most blisteringly colorful games to grace the SNES. And we're treated to a lot of classic Kirby tunes to play to, plus some great original tracks as well, and some surprisingly clear voice clips. There aren't exactly a ton of puzzle games to choose from on the SNES, but from what is available, this has to be considered among the best, and a great addition to the 1995 lineup.
Alright, son. Marshmallow?
Next up, what I think is one of the best action shooting games on the console, and that's Wild Guns, which was developed and published by Natsume, which I think is something of an underrated developer from the 16-bit generation, giving us great titles like Pocky and Rocky, the Ninja Warriors, and some especially cool Power Rangers games. But this just might be my favorite of their SNES games, as I've always been a fan of simple, arcade-style shooting games. And Wild Guns is about as good as it gets. It's essentially a shooting gallery in the same vein as games like Cabal and Nam 1975. but set in a version of the Old West that is absolutely crawling with insane androids trying to blast you to bits. And that's a big selling point of Wild Guns. The unique setting and dazzling visuals make a great first impression, and they're backed up with some solid and fun gameplay. As enemies wander on screen, you annihilate them as quickly as possible with a variety of cool weapons, up to and including a screen-clearing TNT detonation, while also jumping and dodging out of the way of a nearly endless stream of bullets, courtesy of the aforementioned maniacal robots that populate this game, eventually making your way to some truly epic boss battles. It's a ton of fun, obviously, and also offers up some two-player co-op action. And while it's definitely a short game, taking only about 35 to 40 minutes to clear, it's great while it lasts, and the whole thing is topped off with a high-energy Old West-inspired soundtrack that complements the setting and the action-packed gameplay perfectly. This is one of those games that I'll always pop in when I don't have a ton of time on my hands but still want to get a bit of gaming in, as it's perfect for quick bursts of fun. In short, Wild Guns is awesome.
Battery backup saves your progress in your quest to destroy Gygus. It's Earthbound for your Super NES.
Now get the Earthbound Player's Guide free with your purchase of the Super NES Earthbound Game Pack.
Next up is a game that left a huge impression on me when I was a kid, and that is Earthbound, which was underappreciated at the time of its initial release, but despite that fact, is one of the highest rated and most beloved SNES games ever made, and was also one of my personal earliest experiences with an RPG. I was more of an action and fighting game fan as a kid, but when I eventually became friends with someone who was heavily into RPGs, I finally got to try a few for myself, including the SNES Final Fantasy games, Secret of Mana, and another Squaresoft game we'll get to in a bit, but this game in particular captivated me with its contemporary setting, quirky characters and dialogue, and just the unusual, surreal vibe that permeates it. The story about a kid who sets out on a grand adventure to thwart an alien invasion and save all of humanity while making friends and enemies along the way had me enthralled. I'd never played anything like it before, and honestly haven't played anything like it since. Gone were the vaguely medieval fantasy settings, weapons, and monsters of the Final Fantasy games, and instead replaced with oddball little towns, baseball bats and dirty socks for weapons, and enemies that look like something you might see in a piece of abstract art. The gameplay was simple enough to wrap my 10-year-old mind around while still offering quite a lot of depth and challenge, with the final confrontation against Gygus being at once confusing, slightly terrifying, and oddly mesmerizing. One of those things that when it's over, you don't really know what the hell happened, but you know it was pretty cool. And from start to finish, you're treated to some vibrant visuals, great character designs, hilarious and at times unsettling writing, and music that perfectly complements this strange and wondrous odyssey through a world that feels less like a fantasy and more like a dream. In short, Earthbound is an unforgettable game, and one of the best things that 1995 gave to the world.
Dream Project ドラゴンボールの鳥山明、ドラゴンクエストの堀井雄二、ファイナルファンタジーの坂口裕信。僕らの夢が今時空を超える。クロノトリガー予約キャンペーン実施中。
Last and definitely not least, we have the game that cemented my status as an RPG fan when I was 10 years old, and that's the one and only Chrono Trigger. Don't get me wrong, I thoroughly enjoyed the Final Fantasy games, and obviously I developed a big soft spot for Earthbound, but this game just hit that perfect sweet spot with me. The story was very engaging, having you jump forward and backward through time, meeting a cast of colorful and fun characters, while taking on hordes of monsters in an effort to save the future for all of humanity, eventually coming to a final showdown with the alien menace known as Lavos. It wasn't anything that went over my head, but it kept me interested, and the gameplay made sure I was hooked. Again, it was one of my first experiences with an RPG, so I was new to item and equipment management. But Chrono Trigger made it pretty easy for me, letting me focus more on the combat, which at the time I thought was dazzling, especially combining the abilities of multiple characters for some truly devastating team attacks. And I appreciated that the battles weren't totally random. Sure, a lot of them were pretty much unavoidable, but at least I could see what was coming. And this was a great game for an RPG beginner, but is still very enjoyable today. I didn't know at the time that it was the result of this super team of artists and designers that made this game, but I had just become interested in anime, particularly Dragon Ball Z, so I was at least able to recognize Akira Toriyama's classic art style. And on the whole, this is a very good-looking game, both in terms of the visual quality and the art direction, with the character and enemy designs as well as all of the environments looking fantastic. And the soundtrack is, of course, one of the all-time greats. My interest in RPGs has honestly waned over the years, but this is one game that I know I can always go back to and still have a great time with. Chrono Trigger is certainly one of, if not the best games to grace the SNES in 1995, and among the best games on the console, period. It's a true classic. So there you go, everybody. Those are what I think are the best SNES games of 1995. I hope you enjoyed the video. I tried to keep each segment pretty short, just because I don't really like making extremely long videos. So I tried to keep this one like under 30 minutes as best I could. And I might have full reviews coming for individual games that were featured in this video. I'm not sure yet. But these are the ones that I think were the best. They're just some of the best SNES games, period. Like 94, 95, even some of the games in 96, SNES was really hitting this like great stride with like RPGs, some like really great fighting games, action titles, platformers, all that great stuff. So yeah, late period SNES. Don't sleep on it because there's some amazing games in that time period. Anyway, again, let me know what your favorite SNES game from 1995 is. I'd love to hear from you. And until next time, thanks for watching, everybody, and stay awesome. I'll see you then. Goodbye.